Yeah? All right. So, yeah, about sort of the only connection I have to the hip-hop world is now that I have a doctor in front of my name. That's about it. Um, and I was going to try and play some sample-based live coding beats. It's not working, so I'm just going to jump right in. So for the past 6 years, I've been a researcher and practitioner of animated music notation and been studying contemporary animated scoring practices. So during this talk, I'm going to talk about what that might be, sort of a brief kind of speculative history of that, and if there's time, try and get into how I'm seeing a connection with the Sample Music Festival and sample music in general. If we don't get to it, hopefully the first two parts are useful. So, what is animated music notation? Animated music notation describes any notational approach that is represented in real time as a necessarily dynamic set of notational symbols that rely on the functional relationships between these symbols to prescribe musical actions. So, basically, it's not moving, but if you have a score where you have things happening in it that indicate something, then it's necessary. If you have a score where it can work without that motion, then it's unnecessary. So, for instance, a conventional score that just happens to move, it doesn't need to move, okay? So hopefully this will make more sense. So quick outline, a meta-narrative of motion in notational practices, the quote-unquote first wave of contemporary animated scoring practices, and if we get to it, post-literacy in sample-based musical practices and contemporary animated scoring practices. So, the use of motion in musical notation goes back to at least the 1800s. What we see here is an image from a patent application for the key indicator for musical instruments from 1886. Indicators popped up quite a bit during this time, with the idea that common practice notation, or notes on a staff, made it too difficult for students to learn how to play an instrument. And so the idea was if these people could invent these devices, it would encourage students to play instruments because they wouldn't have to learn notation. So in this example, you see these marks here that are below the standard notation. So that would be a big piece of paper, and that would be pulled down mechanically past a metal bar, which you can sort of see right above the keys. And basically, when you would see one of these black squares, these black marks, go past that metal bar, you would play the corresponding key. So this is still very much of interest to regarding the commercialization of music pedagogy. So here's a short clip of something that looks incredibly similar. And also this, which is another kind of idea of like using indication to elicit a physical response from a performer. So in this case, a young student who's learning how to play the piano.
What if you could illuminate your path to self-expression? With the illuminating piano from McCarthy Music, you can see how music is played. Hear how it sounds. Then play it yourself.
So theoretically, then you can play it yourself. Is there anybody here from McCarthy Music? Okay, it's a pretty silly device. But the idea still is the same, is how can we get past notation? Going back to earlier in the 20th century, we can look at the work of Max Fleischer, who invented the famous bouncing ball. So there were some issues with the sing-alongs that would happen before film showings, where the audience couldn't stay together. So Max Fleischer, always the innovator, animated a ball that would bounce in time with the music, which of course we now call karaoke. And although I don't know how many different kinds of karaoke machines they are, but in general, they illuminate the words as you are supposed to sing them. So it's a little different, because generally you know the song you're about to sing, but still the idea is there, is to keep people on time and keep them with it. with a very simple type of notation that steps away from traditional notational practices. And of course, Guitar Hero, which I assume everybody in here knows Guitar Hero. But a series of color-coded cursors descend the screen, and as they make contact with the nodes or the circles at the bottom, you play the corresponding button on the guitar. Okay, so the whole idea with the Guitar Hero was to give, I forget the exact quote, but it was basically to give anybody, regardless of their musical experience, the experience of being a rock star, essentially, although a rock star sitting at home by yourself or with your friends. But very effective and completely and totally ubiquitous. And I think to the point that if I'm talking about animated music notation with people who don't want to hear me talk about it, I just say, you know, Guitar Hero, okay? Now, what all of these things have in common is that they're being used to represent, through some form of notation, pre-existing music. Now, if we look at pieces that would fall more on the art music or experimental music side of the spectrum, motion starts to be used to create new music. So this is a piece called Calder Piece by Earl Brown from 1966, and in this piece requires a Calder sculpture, and the percussionists stand around it and use, in addition to some other more conventional notations, use the movement of the sculpture to determine what exactly it is they're supposed to do. So it becomes a necessarily dynamic element. Robert Moran's divertissement number 1, performers wear oversized like beach sunglasses with a 5-line staff, and then you have a popcorn popper, and as you take the lid off, and as the popcorn flies out, you interpret the kernels as notes. Okay, so it ends up just sounding very quick and very crazy. This is me in one of the very rare performances of this piece that was actually captured on tape. Okay, Circuitry by Pauline Oliveros from 1967 has a grid that is illuminated. I believe it can be illuminated manually, but also using feedback from the performers. But again, there's this dynamic aspect to it that's indicating to the performers the kind of music they should be making at any given moment. And at the end of the performance, the score turns off. So there's not really a record of the score in the same way as there would be with traditional notation. Ramon Sender's Tropical Fish Opera, like Moran's Divertissement, but an aquarium with a 5-line staff around the side, performers sit around it and interpret the movement of the tropical fish. And so with this piece, Sender was very clear to say there needs to be a heater in the tank, otherwise the fish will get lethargic and they'll stop moving, okay? So this was very important. And I believe this piece is from the 60s. I apologize, I don't remember. So a very brief kind of overview of the use of motion in scores for new music. Okay, so the first wave of contemporary animated scoring practices, I'm still kind of in the process of figuring this out and what that might mean. But it seemed to me that there was a kind of particular aesthetic that was emerging, specifically in the United States, Iceland, Australia, and a little bit in Europe. And so it's not always the best idea to try and say something that's called first wave and then include yourself in it, but you know, what do I have to lose? So I believe that there's several primary characteristics of what this means. A tendency towards the use of graphic notational elements over common practice or traditional notation. An emphasis on objective prescription or specificity over suggestive or vague notational designs, as is often the case in graphic scores from the mid to late and still 20th and 21st century. Limited timbral variety, limited pitch content, and limited instrumental diversity. And an emphasis on rhythmic coordination and variation. So I'm going to start out just by showing a few clips from a piece I wrote in 2012. So this is a piece for 15 percussionists, and the idea was to try and make a really, really, really hard percussion piece that only needed 1 or maybe 2 rehearsals to get pretty good, if not really good. results. And the piece is based on phasing, which I'm sure we all know what that is, but in case somebody doesn't, it's where you have a steady tempo or speed, and then another tempo or speed on a different instrument that slowly speeds up or slows down or goes out of phase. So if you had two turntables playing the same beat, it's very easy to put them out of phase and very hard to put them together, which is why all of your virtuosi are so much fun to watch. But with this piece, I wanted to start in unison, and then instead of having a bass tempo, everybody would speed up, but they would speed up at different rates. So from a notational standpoint, this is a really challenging situation. From a rehearsal standpoint and from a performance standpoint, all these things are really, really hard. Some of the easiest things in music are the simplest ideas, like speed up to this point while you speed up to this point, but get to that point at the same time is a weirdly challenging thing to do. So I'm just to describe the notation quick. You see 15 large circles, and each one, as you'll see, sort of functions like a metronome. There's a circle on the top there that will just go back and forth, and then there's two nodes on the side, and each of those corresponds to either the right hand or the left hand of the performer. So if I'm watching that bottom right one, when that cursor hits the right side, I just play with my right hand, with the left side with my left hand. So all these guys are doing is just back and forth, back and forth. It's very simple. So this first clip is sort of unison, but then it gets into the phasing process. And just playing junk metal. Okay, so again, very simple actions by each performer, but already very complex, or a lot of complexity is already emerging. During this section, they're playing pieces of wood, and they're all maintaining a unique tempo. So if you can imagine being with 14 of your closest friends, stand in a row and say, I'm going to hit this, and then you have to hit yours 100 milliseconds after mine, and then you have to be 100 milliseconds after yours, et cetera. So it goes, brrrm, very challenging. And at this one, this section, everybody's slowing down at different rates. Okay, so just with these three short examples from that piece, there's an emphasis on objective prescription or specificity. It's not suggestive. There's not room for improvisation. Limited timbral variety and pitch content. Not much instrumental diversity, although every instrument does sound a little bit different. It's not like having a violin and a French horn and a modular synthesizer player. It's so very limited. And an emphasis on rhythmic coordination and variation. So I'm just going to look at some other works by other composers really quick to kind of extend this idea. Oh, sorry. So in this work by Cat Hope entitled Chrome Arrow, the performers follow a color-coded scrolling score to indicate the moments at which they begin the indicated sound and the relative quality of that sound based on its vertical location and thickness. So this type of score is called a scrolling score as per Cat Hope and Lindsay Vickery. And you'll see it essentially is a large, long image that is just moved across the screen, and it passes a line, a playhead. And that indicates the moment at which the performers are to start events or change events or end events. So very effective approach for coordinating electronic musicians, but also really any kind of musician. In this next piece by Paulav and Paulsen, Sadras, the toy pianist is instructed to play some pitch each time one of the attack cursors, denoted here, you'll see a bunch of swirling black circles, every time they make contact with the right side of the container that they're in. So the chaotic behavior of the physics engine produces results that are likely impossible to predict, but still, the expectations of the performer are exceptionally clear and very easy to follow. And that's where I hit play. So this is a really, I think, beautiful example. Kind of has the hyper-minimalist qualities of a lot of these works, but also is a beautiful score to watch. In this piece, study number 17, by yours truly, for laptop orchestra, this score runs on each performer's laptop while they're playing, and they basically, all they have to do is press on each of those rotating circles in order, from 1 up to 15. And there's some bonus things they can do and stuff like that. So they're running autonomously from one another to create this sort of general sound world, but they're not coordinated, okay? So this, again, makes it possible to notate something fairly specifically, but not require the performers to actually understand conventional notation. And also, it's, in a sense, is a fusion of the score with the instrument. Similarly, oh, I have no video. Oh, no. There we go. Okay, so in this piece, this is in a large black box space. There were 15 of these platters, these white platters, which are about 13 inches in diameter, piece of plywood painted white. And the center of it is a tuned desk bell, like you'd find in a hotel. And projected down onto that are these very simple notations, just a red circle converging on the bell. So it indicates the moment at which you're supposed to play the bell. This piece wasn't intended for performance, but as an installation that people could come in and engage with the work in any way they wanted to. But I encouraged people to learn how to play it, and sure enough, when they had the opportunity to perform it, they took advantage of it. Uh-oh. we have a problem that I'll fix. Sorry. This is here. Deny, deny. I'm sorry for this. PowerPoint is such a great program. There we go. So again, the idea is this really tight rhythmic coordination, even though it ends up sounding kind of vaguely like wind chimes. It's a little bit chaotic. The notation itself in many of these pieces is generative. It's in that it's generated on the fly. It won't be the same every time it's run. That piece is no different. For time. Okay, so this is another example of a scrolling score by Leafcutter John. In this piece, each color, or I should say each person would be assigned to a different colored line, and so the green might be a particular group of instruments, et cetera. And then they are following this in terms of the thickness of the lines and also the height of the lines in the vertical space to determine pitch or the quality of the sounds. Okay, so one of the, I think, primary distinctions between these sorts of works and a lot of the works that I showed earlier, the Oliveros and Moran and things like that, have to do with the technologies we have available to us. And so they're generally screen-based. They're often digital, running off a computer. Occasionally, some works are more in the analog realm. And this piece called Free as in Beer by a composer based in Birmingham named Andy Ingemels is a good example of this. And so as you'll see, there is, I'll start it and I think I can just talk over it. So the participants are putting colored dots on those pieces of paper, like a grid, and they put them in the slot, and somebody's in the box there. So every time somebody gives them some notation, Andy is probably in there, they get a beer. So he's giving people beer in exchange for them writing his music, which is very smart. And now what we have here is they're manually pulling the score across the stage in front of the musicians. This is, of course, far more improvisatory, but still the idea exists that motion is a fundamental aspect of this kind of a score. Okay, a composer named Guðmundur Steinn Gunnarsson from Iceland has been involved in making these kinds of scores for, I think, probably over 10 years now, or about 10 years. Certainly one of the most prolific composers working in this field. And also one of the, I would say, few people that have made so much work that still uses some form of sort of quasi-traditional notation, but again, in a dynamic context. So this piece for flute choir, what I find very interesting about it is that he does a very good job of controlling the rhythmic aspects of the music, and even though he has control over pitch, still keeps that very limited, and really, it really feels like there's a focus on rhythm and on specificity. And again, playing each event as it reaches the red playhead. Okay. And I think this will be the last piece I show an example of. It's called Tu Viti by a composer named Bergrun, who's also Icelandic and has a name that I don't know how to pronounce her last name. But her first name is Bergrun. And her website is bergrun.com to make up for the fact that I cannot say her last name. So this piece is for 2 electric guitars, and you will see there are 2 lines on the floor appearing to extend from the performers. As it appears, they turn on the volume, and as it widens, they detune. One detunes up, and one detunes down. It's a very, very simple idea, but a really kind of lovely kind of timbral variation and pitch variation that happens, but also very easy to follow and to coordinate. Okay, so that quick overview is finished. But I want to just point out that I only talked about 3 or 4, maybe 5 composers. These are just a couple screenshots of my websites that I run. So over here, this is a bunch of pictures of people's scores. Each one corresponds to a different composer who's working in this field. The one in the middle is the same score as that, except it's a little bit easier to navigate. And then this over here is my website, which has about 50 of my own pieces that use this kind of notation. And then Pauli Ivan Paulsen's animatednotation.blogspot.com was really the first website that started to deal with these kinds of ideas in a more global way, I guess. So I'm going to try and stop early just to keep everything going, but I just want to talk really quickly about where I was kind of going to get to for the sake of the SMF. And that's to talk about post-literate. So the idea of post-literate refers to the emergence of magnetic tape, MIDI samplers, controllers, all of these things, so that people could connect with music without having to go to school, without having to understand notation, without having to learn a traditional instrument. These sorts of wonderful things were emerging. And when you have this kind of access, you start to be, you're able to create new kinds of music that you couldn't do otherwise. I think that being a part of a festival like this is really kind of amazing for the kind of work that I do, because I consider it very much as a post-literate notational form, because it doesn't require the kind of training or the kind of schooling that most other types of notated music, with the exception maybe of graphic notation, generally require. And some other things I was just thinking about. This is sort of like the speculative 3 or 4 minutes, but so before there was a literate tradition, there was a pre-literate tradition where monks would basically learn all of their chants through the oral tradition. So by listening, they'd memorize them. There might be a score, but it would be primarily used to jog their memory if they got lost or something like that. And so in thinking about that, and I understand that there are ways to notate music for the turntable. Of course, Alex has done some really nice work with that, and other people. But because it has this kind of visceral physicality to it, and we have things like YouTube and all of that, being able to see how these things work and being able to mimic or mirror the kinds of moves that people are making and to recreate the same kinds of sounds just by doing that, I think there's a really nice analogy or metaphor to the kinds of notational practices that I'm interested in. You're mirroring the movement of this thing going back and forth and just kind of doing exactly what it says. It's a little, has a little bit of a fetish vibe too, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with control. And that would be a whole other talk. So, instrument as notation as compositional and performance practice. We are going to skip. And I'm just going to end with the 2 things. The representational and performance immediacy demonstrated by sample-based musical practices demonstrates an analogous relationship to the streamlined immediacy and post-literate representations found in contemporary animated scoring practices. And that post-literate musical practices that depend on new, non-traditional notational forms, or the use of technologies that transcend the conventional emulation of pre-existing musical instruments and practices, Guitar Hero, for example, enable new forms of musical expression and introduce a vast array of specialized literacies, complete with their own aesthetics, tendencies, and limitations. Thank you very much.